tonight. Leaders on both sides of the aisle in Congress, in the media, in our intelligence services, in virtually every overfunded think tank in Washington, have suddenly aligned tonight on a single point of agreement. America must go to war in Syria immediately. Bashar al-Assad cannot continue to lead that country. He must be overthrown. Assad is an evil man, they tell us. His latest crime is a chlorine gas attack carried out over the weekend by his forces against a rebel-held suburb of Damascus. Assad's poison gas suffocated children. Pictures of the aftermath of that are all over the internet, and they are horrifying. Assad is a monster. That's the official story. Almost everyone in power claims to believe it. The push to war in Syria, by the way, has united politicians from both sides. Lindsey Graham and Howard Dean typically agree on very little. Not much at all. But today they are both calling for war in Syria. Graham is demanding massive attacks on the Syrian military. Dean is going even further than that. On Twitter, he called the president, quote, a wimp for merely sending thousands of troops and launching tons of bombs at Syria. That's not enough for Howard Dean, who, as you may remember, once ran for president as the peace candidate. Tonight, he wants total war in Syria. Television pundits, of course, strongly agree. This morning, the foreign policy team over on MSNBC explained that it's far more important for American troops to fight in Syria than it is to secure our own border here in America. Watch.
There's no question that now, all these years later, it is Donald Trump's challenge. He has to take action. He's spoken to Macron. What he ought to do is a coordinated action. There has to be a comprehensive response.
As Trump leaves to fight his imaginary border war, he's leaving the real war where we could make a difference, and said he's turning it over to Assad and to Iran and to ISIS. This is something that Barack Obama wouldn't even do if confronted with these set of facts.
Trump has to take action in Syria. Everyone nods sagely. That ought to make you nervous. Universal bipartisan agreement on anything is usually the first sign that something deeply unwise is about to happen, if only because there is nobody left to ask skeptical questions. And we should be skeptical of this, starting with the poison gas attack itself. All the geniuses tell us that Assad killed those children. But do they really know that? Of course they don't really know that. They're making it up. They have no real idea what happened. Actually, both sides in the Syrian civil war possess chemical weapons. How would it benefit Assad using chlorine gas last weekend? Well, it wouldn't. Assad's forces had been winning the war in Syria. The administration just announced its plans to pull American troops out of Syria, having vanquished ISIS. That's good news for Assad, and about the only thing he could do to reverse it and to hurt himself would be to use poison gas against children. Well, he did it anyway, they tell us. He's that evil. Please. Keep in mind, this is the same story they told us last April. Do you remember that? It was almost exactly a year ago. The new administration announced it was no longer seeking to depose Assad from power. Regime change was no longer our policy. So the usual war chorus in Washington started yelping, went berserk, and days later, Assad supposedly used sarin gas against civilians in Syria. There was video. We bombed a Syrian airbase in response to that. At the time, this show asked what seemed like the obvious question: are we really sure that Assad did that? It seems weirdly timed and counterproductive to him. Shut up, they explained. Of course we're sure. What an unpatriotic question. But of course they were lying. 2 months ago, the Secretary of Defense admitted that actually we still have no proof that Assad used sarin gas last year. The story, it turns out, was propaganda. It was designed to manipulate Americans, just like so much of what they say. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. But just for the sake of argument, let's assume they're not lying this time. Let's assume Assad did just use chlorine gas against kids. He's perfectly capable of that, by the way, not defending his moral character. Let's say he did do it. Would that be worth starting a new war over? Overthrowing Assad's regime in Syria would result in chaos. Many thousands would die. And in fact, we might likely see the genocide of one of the last remaining Christian communities in the Middle East, and we ought to care about that. Some of the dead, of course, would be American servicemen. A new war would cost us tens of billions of dollars, maybe hundreds of billions. Would it make America safer? Would it make the region more stable? Let's see. How exactly did regime change work in Iraq and Libya? Doesn't matter, say our moral leaders on CNN and everywhere else. Atrocities like this cannot be tolerated. Okay, but let's be real. We do tolerate atrocities like this all the time. For example, there's a devastating famine killing children in Yemen right now. The Saudis are causing that famine. Should we drop tomahawks on Riyadh in response? Not until it's on YouTube, apparently. When you conduct foreign policy by viral video, pictures are essential. But in real life, Syria is a highly complicated place. With Assad gone, who would run it exactly? Do we have another strongman in place to install? Or is it our hope that a stable democracy will magically appear in the wake of this protracted civil war? And who exactly are these moderate rebels you're always hearing about, the ones that we're supporting with your tax dollars? Well, a lot of them turn out to be Islamist crazies. For example, the city where the chemical attack just occurred is mostly controlled by the Army of Islam. It's a radical group that has called for establishing an Islamic state under Sharia law in Syria. That group's founder called for exterminating all Shia Muslims and Alawites from the country. But we're supposed to wage a new war on this group's behalf. Why is that exactly? Back in 2013, when the Syrian civil war was still in its early days, one onlooker weighed in on Twitter. Here's part of what he wrote, quote, "We should stay the hell out of Syria. The rebels are just as bad as the current regime. What will we get for our lives and billions of dollars? Zero." In another tweet, he said this, quote, "Let the Arab League take care of Syria. Why are these rich Arab countries not paying us for the tremendous cost of such an attack?" And in yet another tweet, he said this, "What will we get for bombing Syria beside more debt and a possible long-term conflict?" Of course, you know who wrote that. It was Donald Trump, and he was right. And that's one of the reasons he got elected president. And now the same people who brought you a dying American middle class, undefended American borders, and endless pointless wars in countries you could not find on a map are telling the president he's got to depose Assad for reasons that are both unclear and demonstrably dishonest. And by the way, it may happen. But before it does, Congress ought to consider a brand new constitutional amendment. Let's call it the Lindsey Graham Amendment. And here's what it would say. Congress shall topple no government until it finishes rebuilding the last government it toppled. And furthermore, talk show generals shall be required to personally visit the battlefield of every war they advocate for. End of amendment. That would have an immediate and positive effect. Let's hope it passes. Senator Roger Wicker is a Republican representing the state of Mississippi, and he joins us tonight. Senator, thanks for coming on. What is the American national security interest that would be served by regime change in Syria?
Well, if you care about Israel, you have to be interested at least in what's going on in Syria. We're fighting ISIS there. Iran is seeking to dominate the whole region. I think we have national interests in Syria. But let me say this about what candidate Trump may have said, or what he said before he was a candidate. You know, there is information you receive when you're president of the United States that you really don't have as a candidate. And I appreciate the president putting a team around him that I have confidence in. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I think are going to give the president good advice. John Bolton's starting today, and I
there are
think,
smart and decent people around him.
They're going to tell him what he needs to hear.
Well, and there are certainly a lot of those people are smart. But I just want to get back to the core question that I think a lot of voters have, which is what's the American national security interest that is served? You said if you care about Israel, I do care about Israel, but what's the American national security interest that would be served by regime change? You can think of a lot of potential downsides, deaths, cost, et cetera. How would this country become safer by overthrowing Assad?
I'm not sure that regime change is still our goal there. It was the goal of Barack Obama. It hasn't really been our stated goal during this Trump administration. But defeating ISIS in Iraq and in Syria is still our goal. And I think that is in the national interest.
But wasn't defeating ISIS one of the goals of the Assad government? Of course, ISIS was a radical Sunni group. Assad is an Alawite allied with the Shiites. He was fighting ISIS as well. So why wouldn't we, if we believe ISIS is the main enemy, functionally find ourselves on the side of Assad?
Well, you're correct in this sense, and you're correct in many ways. It's complicated in Syria. There's no question about it. I mean, there's not a bunch of white hats and a bunch of black hats. So I'll give you that. We are, and we're not in the business of regime change, so I would challenge that. But it is within our national interest to make sure ISIS is defeated, and we've almost got the job done. I just think it would be a mistake to pull away at this point. I'm very interested in the questions you're asking about whether this is some sort of a hoax, or whether this poison gas attack really didn't happen, was done by someone else.
Well, I'm not suggesting that.
That's a question that Mr. Putin is asking, and he has a right to ask it, and so do you. I find myself on the other side of that issue.
I'm not sure I understand the implication. I'm not sure I understand the implication of adding Putin to that equation.
He's asking. I'm just saying it's a question
that's not relevant. Slow down, Senator. That's not relevant to why I asked the question, and I hope you're not trying to impugn my motive by tying me to Putin, as so many on the left do. Let me ask again. We were told a year ago that the sarin gas attack in Syria was committed by regime forces, by Assad's regime. We learned 2 months ago that we don't really know that we were lied to about that. I would think as a U.S. Senator, you would have an interest in getting to the truth, because the truth matters, doesn't it?
I think it's perfectly fine for someone in a position like you to ask that question.
Why aren't you asking the question?
I'm convinced. Well, I've been listening to a lot over the last year, and for my purposes, I'm convinced that Bashar Assad was very much involved in the attack a year ago. The United Nations Security Council is currently, based on information I've heard, I think the United Nations Security Council. Can you characterize it for us? Because the Secretary of Defense. I'm sorry, I wouldn't typically interrupt you, but you suggested that I was somehow allied with Putin. So I think I can press you on this question. I'm suggesting that you asked the same question that he asked, and that's fair.
So I must be a Russian agent. I get it, right?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that.
Because it's a very obvious question, actually, and the Secretary of Defense said 2 months ago that we didn't have proof, but you apparently have proof that the Secretary of Defense doesn't have. Could you characterize it for us?
No. I'm not going to get into that further.
Okay. So are you satisfied that we know for a fact that the Assad regime, acting against its own strategic interests, was behind the chlorine gas attack this weekend?
And as I was about to say, Tucker, the UN Security Council is looking at that very issue right now. The President of the United States has concluded that, in fact, Bashar Assad was involved in this and was responsible for it. And I assume he's making that statement based on the best facts he can get from the Secretary of Defense and from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his incoming National Security Advisor.
Okay, well, I guess Putin and I would like a little more detail on that before we launch a new war on the basis of it. Do you think that's a fair question to ask?
I think you are asking interesting questions, and they need to be asked. Where I come down is that we have a strategic interest there, and it doesn't make sense for us to leave without getting the job done. I would be results-based in Syria rather than timeline-based.
Okay. Well, that was revealing. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Theo Padnos knows a lot about Syria. He's a journalist who spent 2 years as the hostage of al-Nusra's Syrian Islamist rebel group, and he joins us tonight. Theo, thanks for coming on. So one of the many questions here is who is behind the chemical attack of the weekend, the chlorine gas attack? And I think we all assume it. We saw the pictures, so something happened. So one of the first questions is the Assad regime the only group in the region that possesses these weapons?
Of course not. We have videos, and I have been in conversation with these people. I mean, I lived with them for 2 years. I know what their goals are in life. They are interested in carrying out a war of extermination against their enemies, particularly the Alawites, but really against the Syrian government. And you know, they're more than willing to use any weapon whatsoever, anything it takes, to rid themselves of their enemies. I'm quite persuaded that their goal is total annihilation of the enemy, and they think that chemical weapons will do the trick. And they talk to me about, you know, these ambitions of theirs to exterminate the enemy. I have no doubt that this is, you know, something that they desire. It's their dream. They believe that they own this land, that God gave it to them, and that they should kick the other people out, kill them.
So since you spent years as a captive and are familiar with some of these groups, characterize for us, if you will, some of the rebel groups that that the United States appears to be supporting and that we hope will take the place of the Assad regime once they're deposed?
I mean, I can give you this characterization. I can tell you that the people that we believe we're supporting, I mean, as soon as we give a nickel to these people, it goes in 10 different directions. They divide every asset that is fungible up among the people that, among themselves. We don't know who we're giving our guns and our money to. We just don't. And even though we clear them, we vet them, and we train them, we don't know what happens once they go into the country. And it's just, it's an unexplored emptiness, those places that the rebels control. The reason why we cannot investigate and figure out who actually committed these chemical attacks is because every time any outside person that goes into these areas is either disappeared or will end up in a cage or tortured or will have his head cut off. So it's really, it's quite impossible to explore the origin of these crimes. It's true that there are a number of possible culprits, but before we go starting any wars, we should investigate properly, and we can't do that now because we cannot access the scene of the crime.
Well, yeah, so, thank you for reminding us how complex this all is, and you have, of course, first-hand experience with it. Theo Padnos, I appreciate it.
You bet.
You've been hearing it day after day on virtually every show on the other channels. Defending America's own borders is a fake issue. In fact, it's immoral, while intervening in Syria 6,000 miles away is a real one and a moral imperative. Does anybody actually believe that? Why are people saying that exactly? Colonel Doug McGregor is a retired Army colonel, author of the book Margin of Victory, and he joins us tonight. Colonel, as you see, people make simultaneously the case against using force to protect our southern borders, but in favor of using force to protect the territorial integrity of Syria. What do you think?
Well, I think it's lunacy, to be perfectly blunt. It's a crazy idea. First of all, the United States Armed Forces, at least as far as the Constitution is concerned, exist primarily to defend the United States. That includes its borders against foreign penetration. And for 150 years, we've tried to defend those borders. For 100 of those years, we had the United States Army on the border. From 1867 onward, we built forts. We had thousands of troops down there. All the generals that commanded our forces during the Second World War served on the Mexican border. We've been dealing with criminality, corruption, forms of terrorism for decades. And this is not a new problem. People need to understand that Mexico is America's soft underbelly. Before World War II and the Rainbow Plans, we recognized that Mexico presented a threat because Mexico also sides with our enemies. Mexico sided with Germany during World War I against us. Mexico was the principal platform for the KGB in the Western Hemisphere all through the Cold War. Mexico is hostile to us. And for the last 40 or 50 years, anyone heading north in Mexico who said they wanted to go to the United States got to ride on public transportation for nothing. Now add to that the drug trafficking, which is now capitalized on corruption on a scale never before seen in the history of that country, and then the millions and millions and millions of people that had penetrated our border. Then look at the nexus of terrorism and criminality in the Caribbean basin, where we intercept every day thousands of communications in Farsi, in Arabic, in Russian, in Chinese. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that we have real conflict in Mexico, and we ignore it at great peril. We're already spending billions to deal with the consequences of illegal immigration and the criminality here. We have criminals in our jails, costs us hundreds of billions of dollars every year. This has got to stop. Donald Trump said he would control the border. It's time to put the military on the border. The National Guard is nice, but the National Guard is not experienced in this. The regular Army is. We have thousands of people with experience. We need to put them on the border, and we need to secure it. Then we can rotate the National Guard through.
Thank you for that plain explanation, Colonel. I have hard-earned, and I appreciate it.
Okay.